Hello and welcome to No Wrong Choices, the podcast that explores the career journeys of interesting and accomplished people in pursuit of great stories and actionable insights. I'm Larry Samuels, and in just a moment I'll be joined by my co-hosts Tushar Saxena and Larry Shea. But before we kick off, we have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what we do, please take a moment to support us by following No Wrong Choices on your favorite podcast platform, such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. We also ask that you connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and X, or by visiting our website at NoWrongChoices.com. On our site, you can sign up for our subscriber list or explore our blog, which digs into each one of the episodes that we're putting forward. Your support helps us keep bringing these great stories to light. Now let's get started. I will be setting things up, followed by Tushar Saxena doing a deeper introduction. Now joining No Wrong Choices is the journalist, TV anchor, and media strategist Courtney Kealy. Courtney's background is truly remarkable, highlighted by her time spent as a Middle East correspondent, reporting from the Capitol on January 6th, and experience on the ground in multiple war zones while working for networks such as Fox and Al Jazeera. Courtney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right, so guys, full disclosure, as we have with many of our guests, I have known Courtney Kealy for more than a decade at this point. We had the opportunity to work together when she was over at Fox, I was over at Fox, and I was just a rookie, essentially a rookie foreign editor at that point. And that was when we had we had actual reporters out in parts of the world. We had someone in the UK, someone in Russia, we had someone in the Far East, someone in Malaysia, and our Middle East reporter at that time was Courtney Kealy. And I'll tell you what, you cannot have a better teacher on how to be a good foreign editor than to deal with a Courtney Kealy, because she really gave me a great deal of insight into how to think about the politics of the world, especially the Middle East, and even to think in a broader scope of how that all kind of interacts with the U.S., how the U.S. is also part of that world, or part of the world in general, but especially how the politics of the Middle East really kind of meld and gel with what goes on here in the U.S. So, Courtney, once again, look, I could not have asked for a better teacher at that time, and to have you join us for just a few minutes, it's such a pleasure, honestly.
That's great. I have no idea what I said back then, but I'm glad it was helpul.
I'll tell you what, you
must have been very moving.
I'll tell you what, look, she could be very strict at times, but hey, this is what really what's happening, or she could be like, hey, maybe you should think a little bit differently here, etc. So, Courtney, tell us now what you're doing these days.
Well, that's a big question. I'm watching a lot of media implode in a different way than I had predicted in 1999 or 87. So I feel like I've gone through this trajectory over the last 25 years, where the news is the same, the events are the same, the way you should cover them ethically, clear-eyed, impeccably, forensically, but the actual agencies have changed, and how much you can put out there have changed, and how much disinformation, misinformation is out there. So currently I'm not right in the field. I'm not doing anything particularly dangerous, and I'm not on the presidential beat, and I'm not on the Middle Eastern beat. And I'm watching both, but particularly the Middle Eastern beat, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, places where I started my career, exact places, and trying to figure out where I can be of service. And I'm at a loss right now of where do I help, and how do I help?
Courtney, I get the fun part. I get to go back to your early life. Talk about growing up. I mean, was this always the dream? I love that question. It always kind of nails it. Was this always what you wanted to do?
I didn't really have anybody in my family that was a journalist, so I wasn't really informed about what it would be. My mom was an artist, and my dad was on Wall Street. So I knew what I didn't want to be, and I knew that I wanted to be creative and an artist somehow. Somehow my mom gave me that feeling, like, be creative and you should be creative. And then in high school, it was writing and photography. And one of my best friend's dads was on the local news, and one of my best friend's other dads was on Z100 Stan Z Burns.
Oh, wow.
And
Awesome.
going back to
A legendary
Stan Z
station
Burns,
in New York for those who don't
10-10
know.
Wins. You know, you make it
Yes.
in New York when somebody's heard the back, they've heard your voice in the back of a cab on 10-10 Wins.
Totally.
Absolutely.
That's like a certain peak. And
Pinnacle.
what's that? Pinnacle. Yeah, no, it's like
It's the
just like,
pinnacle.
You know, WABC, like all those old wonderful radio sounds. And so when I saw my friend Jenny Burns, she told me years later, she said, you peppered my dad with questions. He was so delighted. None of us gave a toss. And you were always asking about radio. So I had it in me without realizing it. Thanks to Stan Z Burns. And it's really fun to listen to his old stuff. So I was intrigued that he was on the radio. I was intrigued that my friend Sydney's dad, John Johnson, was on the news. And then my mom, with all her creativity, was like, you can be an artist. So the first thing that I did was I became a photographer, took myself very seriously in the middle of high school, the end of high school, and went to a liberal arts school, but they gave me a personalized letter that said, we welcome you with pen and camera.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I was on to something.
So so you were creative, you were a writer, photographer, that's the bug, you're trying to figure things out. I noticed from your profile that you went to the Columbia Journalism School. Is that where you went to college as well?
I went to Kenyon College. I left New York City, just to put things in context. I am of the generation of the preppy murderer. That was a big thing in New York. So you can trace my childhood from the Blackout, Son of Sam, the preppy killer. Preppy killer was a tabloid name for somebody that we knew that was friends with my brother up until a point when he started stealing. My mom even said to my brother once, why doesn't Courtney date him? Which we always say, please, Mom, wow, you really
know how to pick 'em.
have had bad taste in men your whole life.
Oh
It's a
boy.
very zeitgeisty, like latchkey child in the city. Our parents moved us to the city when people were fleeing to the suburbs. They were young. They were Catholic. Life changed, culture changed. And when I was going to first grade, my mom said, we're moving to New York. And my dad said, we'll take a vote if you want to go. My brother Sean and I, 13 months apart, said, no, thank you. No way. And they said, oh, well, too bad. Ben, who was a toddler, Ben votes yes. We're like, that's not fair. And my dad said, so early on, I was like, that's not fair. My dad said, this isn't a democracy. And then we're like, well, why did you let us vote if our vote doesn't count? Bring it right up to now.
My father used to say that
Yeah,
all
but your vote
the
doesn't
time.
count. So I was like, so why do that to us? Our vote didn't count. We moved to New York. My mom, we moved to, because you could then, we moved to 81st Street and Fifth Avenue across from the Museum of Natural
Wow,
Very
nice
nice.
area.
Metropolitan Museum of Art. I took college off. Everybody was really precocious. You could go to clubs really young. You could do anything. And I just said, I'm out of here. So I went to, it was a matter of money too. I went to Kenyon College, liberal arts, welcomed me with pen and camera in hand. But it was like an incubator just to get away from Manhattan, the East Coast. I just needed time to decompress from New York City childhood.
Yep. My son may be saying the same thing one day. We'll find out.
And so Columbia came later after I realized, after I tried to do it in my 20s and I got to freelancing for the New York Times as a photographer, but it was a real church and state separation between words and pictures. And the internet was coming down the pike and everyone was dialing up. And so when I went to Columbia, they were doing a new media workshop where I hand coded a website. I learned how to integrate text, sound, video, and stills into a website. And the idea was that that's what we're going to do.
So then when did you make that move then from behind the photo lens at that point? When did you say to yourself, okay, I want to move to telling the story for others and go in front of the mic and just become that storyteller that you are?
Well, it took a while, and I think this is fair to let people know. Yeah, I mean, there was one thing I didn't want to have a dysfunctional life, and here I was going straight towards journalism. what?
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like watching a car about to crash. Like, this is not going to be healthy. I'm not making healthy, no wrong choices, no healthy choices. Or, and I just saw that photojournalism was going to be dying on the vine really quickly, along with newspapers. And that's what I learned at Columbia. So I went you had two choices: go straight through newspapers and try to make your way up that way,
Right.
or go through international and try to make your way up that way. And so find a place in the world where they need stories and it's not overpopulated by foreign correspondents with big expense accounts. And so my boyfriend said, I sent him off to a job fair for international students. He was a science teacher. He called me back. He said, I've got Cairo and Beirut offers, on offer. What do you want?
Wow.
And I said, Beirut. And he said, why? And I said, he just said, why? And I said, and this is the 90s. This is not post 9/11. I said, they were all kidnapped. There's no competition there. I can, okay.
That's a scary thing to say.
Wow.
I was like,
wow.
I was like, everyone got kidnapped. Nobody returned. There's no competition. I could work there.
Jeez.
What a great opportunity.
Right. So there's
Wow.
opportunity
Okay.
so the 10-year travel ban of Americans had been lifted, and I applied for a job to teach from the headmistress, and she hired me to teach journalism, photojournalism, journalism, and newspaper and photography to the class at American Community School, and one English lit class, which I could do from Kenya. So I taught A Prayer for Meany, King Lear, and The Great Gatsby, while learning more from the journalism students than they could learn from me, because they were telling me about the Syrian occupation.
Right.
They were telling me what their parents wouldn't speak of, what wasn't allowed in newspapers. They're like great teen. I love teenagers. And when you have and so we were talking. So I learned in a year all about Beirut and the region in 10 months, while I was getting my sea legs, so to speak. In June of 1999, Netanyahu lost the election.
Right.
Ehud Barak was coming in, and he was coming in to take the Israeli soldiers, the IDF, out of southern Lebanon after 20 plus years. I was driving around Beirut. I was spending my time exploring the South and all the places. They had places where they would show, this was a massacre site, this was a massacre site. Nobody forgets in the Middle East. And my boyfriend at the time was going on trips to Eastern Europe by train with other friends, so that didn't really work out. And I just kept going. And the night I turned in the yearbooks was the night Netanyahu bombed, which I call his FU farewell, because Hezbollah, it was tit for tat. Hezbollah would do this, and somebody would get killed.
Right.
Retaliation. You could go back and forth and tell the retaliation until something unusual happened, and then it would just, really blow up. And this night, he decided to just bomb electrical grids, bomb bridges, several civilians, some college students killed. Everyone called that night. I was at a CNN party with the only other foreign correspondents in town, too, and locals, and I learned from them. But I still wasn't on air. It wasn't until I went and started doing more for abcnews.com that made it. I did more. I traveled to Syria. I traveled Pope John Paul's trip to the Holy Land. I traveled to Hafiz al-Assad's funeral, and at Hafiz al-Assad's funeral, I got a call from some folks in London at ABC News at the time, and they said, "Would you like to go on air? We like your writing." That always gets me. Tell me you like my writing.
So were you writing at that point? You were.
I was writing for abcnews.com, and I was giving my photos because there wasn't enough bandwidth to do video. So I would go out and report. My reporting would get folded into the New York Times with foreign correspondents when I was in location, and I was giving the information, the SOTs, not the SOTs, the interviews, color, all of that would get, because nobody was in Beirut. It would get folded into foreign correspondents who was ever in town or who was ever in Cairo and Jerusalem leading this story. There was only one byline. It was the foreign correspondent bylines. Nobody else.
And Court, before you continue, for those who don't know, Courtney's using a little bit of insider media lingo. SOTs are essentially sound bites for folks. So if you
And
don't
that's
know
for
what,
television.
yeah, it's a
I
television
didn't mean
thing.
to say that for
It's a
print,
television
but
thing.
I would go out and do the interviews. I would take the photographs. I would gather up a lot of information. It used to be called, you would go out and like a junior reporter, and you would just do what they called legwork. You'd leg it, and you go around and you get all this information, and then the pro would fold it in. And so I would give it to the pros, and they'd fold it in. So I learned how to report from the best of them in the field, because I could tell what they took and what they didn't take.
Sure.
My photograph, I figured out what my photographs was going in and out. So I had a photo agency. I had foreign correspondents I was close with, and I was also doing things for abcnews.com, and they were kind of articles on the web. So when ABC News called me and said in London, "Hey, why don't you do a tape of us on TV?" I was like, "Oh, I love that idea." And secretly, I've always wanted to do that. I just never admitted to myself because I thought I was too much of a young feminist to get in front of a camera until they asked me.
So I want to ask a question just to kind of bring things together in my own mind right now, because I feel like we're running.
Yeah.
And so you go to Beirut with your boyfriend who applies for a job. You head overseas and you're teaching at a school over there to get grounded within the community.
Yeah.
And you're learning your way around. You're learning the language. You're getting a better feeling for the history and everything else. And ultimately, are you thinking about becoming a reporter the entire time? Because you talked about, okay, so you saw that as an opportunity. So that was your goal. That was your objective when you went.
I'm going to be a foreign correspondent. At this point, it's crystallized. I've been building up to it throughout my 20s. I've got my master's so I can teach as a backup or if I want to be in academics. But I love the field. I love being in the field. I'm not scared. I'm really comfortable in it. All these things make me, and I'm getting all this feedback from the foreign correspondents. They show up in Jerusalem and they're like, "Oh, Courtney's here. There's going to be a war." And I was like, "Wait, what?" Like, I went to Nightingale.
You're the war lady.
Not a good reputation.
My friends were the Wait What girls. Like, I show up and I'm like, "Wait, what?" I'm like, "Oh, right. I was in Southern Lebanon this whole time with like bombs going off and like figuring out where Hezbollah was and having coffee with Hamas because I was creating a beat for myself by going out and going to the southern suburbs and having coffee with Hamas and going to Hezbollah press office and meeting with them and going at Hezbollah press tour and taking photographs of fighters and I had this great editor at abcnews.com who was like, "Keep writing, keep giving us this stuff."
Yeah,
it was very personal.
So you were doing this for yourself to establish your chops.
Yeah,
and then you got hired by ABC.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was always figuring out the next step. I mean, this was, everyone acts like this is this cataclysmic time where everything is changing. We've been changing the whole time.
Right.
The first time I photographed for the New York Times, it was in black and white film. And I'm not 155 years old. I mean, right? So how did I go from black and white film to a film bag that says the New York Times that you write on? That used to be shipped back in Times to then using 1 hour photos by the time I was in, to get the negatives to feed it into a Nikon scanner, to then having the ethics conversations about what it means when you have a digital camera. From my boutique photo agency to being swallowed up to some behemoth called Getty, all in 5 years.
Wow.
So it was like lily pad to lily pad, and like the story is always everything. And my personal life, like how did an American woman who's almost 6 feet tall, who does not blend, end up walking through the streets of Beirut, hopping on planes to Cairo, hopping on the Palestinian Airlines from Amman to Gaza, meeting Peter Jennings, meeting my heroes. I've already met my photography heroes and I'm meeting my broadcast heroes. And maybe it was the je ne sais quoi of New York, which is I don't give a fuck.
Right.
Right. And I never have.
Yep. You'd be surprised how many people we speak to where that's the attitude, the I don't give a fuck attitude.
I just didn't. I was like, bring it. Like that's just become, my life. And so sure, I guess maybe proximity of like having these incredible this incredible childhood that was this literally the stuff of movies and imaginations and like a feedback loop. So then, of course, if I'm already having these adventures in my childhood, why not continue to go?
Who was that journalist that you looked up to outside of when you were a child? And, you know, obviously you had your friends and their fathers, and they were your first probably influences to see what this life was about. Who were your journalistic influences, whether they be men or women? Who was it that you looked up to as those people who were in the field?
All my heroes were photojournalists. Magnum, documentary, black and white, reportage, going out, covering the world, covering in-depth documentary style, total immersive photojournalism. And that's where I was taking all my workshops and putting all my work into my 20s. And then, you know, up until now, when we have an iPhone, like I saw very quickly after 9/11, all they wanted was for me to go out and get pictures of suicide bombers. And I did because I had access. I did some exclusives. I went to Hamas. I went to a Hamas anniversary. My photographs just started becoming this one-dimensional pictures of people dressed up as fake or, you know, fake suicide bombers saying that's what they were going to do. And Getty wanted me to shoot like a wire service, and my stuff got one-dimensional. And my life in the Arab world wasn't one-dimensional. And so I was burnt out. I moved to Jerusalem to pick up the radio string and do some television because I'd said, do you want to be on TV? You could be a photographer and live in Jerusalem. I was really happy to be away from the pack, be away from the whole circus in Beirut. But I reluctantly went, I went to Jerusalem and I said, like, can I do radio and television? And I did. And so I was freelance for them and I learned the craft by being on ABC News for 2 more years. And I slowly stopped taking photographs and I moved and really committed having my own reel to show people to look for the next job. And the next job was Baghdad, and it was on television.
Right. Oh, wow. All right. So I guess then the next portion of that question is, now you talked a moment ago about how, you know, you essentially were, you know, you're a tall woman who doesn't blend in that part, who doesn't look like a person who's going to blend in that part of the world, but you made yourself, you ingratiated yourself to the community around you, whether that be, you know, high ranking politicians to just the locals to even some of the more militant groups that would be in the area. How did you do that?
You know, at Columbia, for the core course that you started out with was I want to say reading and writing, but that's not it. RW1, reporting and writing, and you would have to choose a place in Queens, and you'd have to report on it. I chose a place in Queens, like on the 7 train, where every single place was different. A Victorian restaurant to like Santeria candles to Irish football to, you know, Gaelic football.
Sure.
And I learned how to create a beat at school. And then I went out in Beirut and was like, well, what would I do? There needs to be somebody that can open the door and introduce me to the Hezbollah press office. There needs to be all of this. So I learned through figuring out myself. I learned through visiting New York Times photographers. I was actually a fixer, even though I didn't know I speak Arabic. I knew my way around. The story was there, and I stayed. And that Netanyahu bombing, people started saying, "You're in the right place. Don't leave."
Right.
So I stopped teaching. I immediately went full on from Egypt Air in Cairo when they took that Egypt Air plane down. That was the next big story after the Netanyahu bombing. I went on assignment through Syria for the travel section of the New York Times. I did stories on all the beaches. I did Hezbollah stories. I did Hezbollah's press tour. I went and met Hamas, after starting to cover it. And so I would get assignments to go places. I would go on spec. I would do, everything was about getting the experience. And then all of a sudden my experience was very, very valuable.
Right.
For several years to everybody that was on that story as well.
So I'm hearing a lot of inquisitive. I mean, this is obviously what's driving you, is you want to find answers. I'm not hearing a lot of fear. Like, I would just be like Beirut, Hamas. I mean, you're talking about places
Disneyland,
that
for God's sake.
Most people run away from. Right. Like you're running towards the fire. Have you always run towards the fire?
Towards it, saunter, like ease on in, I mean, there's one big thing. Growing up in New York, you learn what the real story is, and you realize what's on the cover of the tablets. Right? I want to tell the stories. I always love to tell the stories. My family's storytellers, and then I get to the Middle East, and it's a blank slate.
Right.
And I'm walking through the streets, and like people are as fascinated by me as I am them. 9/11 happens, and everybody at home is like, "Oh my God, get out of there, come home." And I was like, "Well, the bomb happened at home, not here." And Lebanese people called me and said, "Are you okay? We know what it's like for our city, or your city now, to be bombed while you're away." So I was getting calls from everybody. The Palestinians were not the quick photographs that would run to the Palestinian camps and photograph people celebrating a suicide bombing because they were a year into the Intifada. Those pictures were taken early in daylight and used, and I wrote about it for Harvard Neiman reports back then. They were overused in a loop on television to the point where my brother gets a call into me in Beirut, and he's like, "Why are they celebrating?" I said, "They're just not."
Yeah.
And everybody's at home. People are checking on me, making sure I'm okay. So I missed my family. I was terribly homesick. I was often lonely, but I wasn't scared because there were people stepping in, just saying, "Hey, we know what it's like for you. We were in our country, or that's not us."
So, Courtney, Tushar earlier asked you about, being in a town, in an area, and how do you get acclimated? How do you really immerse yourself in the community? And I want to dig into that a little bit further. You've talked about Hamas. You've talked about Hezbollah. Can you earn their trust as a reporter? Like, how do you develop relationships? Do you develop relationships with people within those communities?
Not necessarily, because they'll switch out, well, at least with Hezbollah, I heard that they would switch out their public affairs officers if they got too friendly with reporters. There's a certain level of propaganda they're giving to you to manipulate you that you have to be on your toes about at all times.
Are you nervous? Are you concerned when you're engaging with these people? Like, what's on your mind when you're having these conversations, if anything?
Well, earlier I was worried. I was like more awkward. And then it turned into just really, I was so fed up. I was like, "You're going to give me this again?" Like when I went back in 2017 to learn to the Hezbollah officers, this young woman, and she's like, "Well, you know what we do." "Well, you don't know, but we do this." And I said, I was literally like, "Sweetie, go look for the file and dust it off, open it, find me and ask me a question about Ahmadinejad in Baghdad. Like, come on now." I'm like, can we just acknowledge the fact that I know what you're selling and I'm not buying?
Let's talk about your time now in Israel. So you've gone from Beirut, you've gone from Lebanon to Israel. How long were you in Israel for?
So I had been covering Israel and Jerusalem, disputed capital, and the Palestinian territories, including Gaza, since 1999. I moved there in 2003. That was when the targeted assassinations of Hamas were happening. That era was they took out Sheikh Yassin. They took out his successor. Sheikh Yassin he was brought back in a prisoner swap. He was a spiritual leader of Hamas. He was in a wheelchair. Right. Helicopter gunship took him out with a missile when he was coming out of prayers in his wheelchair. Gruesome, always gruesome. So I rode Arafat's horses. This was when this was coming. I covered Arafat's funeral, and I didn't cover Iraq. So I'd gone with all the circus. I'd gone to Amman, waiting to go into Iraq for the fall of Iraq. That was the next big story. Could I get myself through Syria into northern Iraq? I was talking to clients. Could I get myself in? Finally, I was sitting in Amman, cooling my heels like everybody else, and their mother, like everybody was sitting there. And I don't like crowds like that. I was offered a photography assignment to cover the bird migration up through the DMV. from which is like one of the militarized birds that migrate. Anyway, so I took that assignment in film with Outside Magazine and figured the war will wait if it's big enough. I was really disgusted by the jingoistic idea that we're invading a country with flags on our chest. And so, and I also cried the night of the invasion because I knew from studying Lebanon and Beirut how complicated these places are with all of these different religions. Now we probably, and still almost like as the kid, do we really know what we're doing? Am I the kid in the room? Like, New York, we're growing up, and I was like, this is. I'm already in tears. This is horrific what we're doing. I'm not in any way putting an American flag on. In fact, I'm taking a break and I'm photographing cranes for Outside Magazine. And then I went back, and then I decided the opening was in Jerusalem. Some people got picked up by network. So there was a wide opening in radio. The radio string in Jerusalem in the ABC Bureau was open again. It had been open in 2000. I didn't try for it. I took it this time. I was there for 2 years. I learned radio and television. I did things like the soccer team that became suicide bombers in the West Bank. Survivors of suicide bombs in Israeli hospitals. A lot of Gaza. I've always done a lot of Gaza. And I would also shoot. So one time I was photographing the ceremonial horses that were supposed to be for a Palestinian state. And I hopped on them and rode one of the horses. And everyone's like, God, you rode Arafat, one of Arafat's horses. And I was like, that were supposed to be for the state, that were at this, ramshackle stable with, a lot of holes in the plastic and everything from suicide bombing. The local kids got to ride them, but it never came to fruition. And then I covered Arafat's funeral. And then back to, Iraq was going off a cliff. And I was like, why don't I do that next?
So in Israel, when you were there in Jerusalem, what was that life like? Well, I mean, covering Israel during that time period with Arafat still in power at that point. How much different was it from when you were in Beirut, from when you were cooling your heels in Jordan? What was that? I mean, obviously there's still that certain amount of, for lack of a better term, that craziness that kind of lives in that region. But how different was it from the other parts of the Middle East that you'd been in?
Well, when I was in Beirut and other places, I was much more of quite the minority. People didn't leave the American embassy. It was off. It was way off out of town, and had been attacked too many times. So an American rocking around at a moped and going clubbing and then going to southern Lebanon, where a war at my doorstep was quite something. But my friends were Lebanese, and they were Lebanese expats who were coming back that maybe had lived there, and then their parents moved back because this was a big time of Rafiq Hariri was the prime minister. He was rebuilding things. I covered his election. He called me his lucky charm. I sat in the back of his car. He eventually got blown up a couple of years later on Valentine's Day. And I was no longer in the backseat of his car.
Yeah, pardon me for laughing, Cor, but it seems like everyone you seem to know who's a high-ranking person in the Middle East, at one point or another, in interactions with you, gets blown up.
To get close to power is often to get close to assassinations in the Middle East, right?
True.
Proximity of power is like proximity of danger. Once I got stuck in this is a really quick aside, but it's a very good story. I was reporting, doing the legwork for a very well-known foreign correspondent. And my trusty driver and I, Hussein, was like my driver, my guru, my fixer. Like he and I just were like this crack team. We always worked together. So we went out into the Bekaa Valley. If you think of Lebanon, it's like sea, mountains, valley. Into the Bekaa Valley, where a lot of training went on in the 80s, and a lot of Iranian guards and Revolutionary Guards and all that stuff. And so there's a town called Nabi Sheep where one of the Secretary Generals of Hezbollah, Moussawi, had gone to give a speech on their anniversary of the founding of Hezbollah. He was in a car with his wife and his daughter. An Israeli helicopter came out, dropped a bomb on him, and then they took the car, and it's encased in glass as a as a shrine. And this was when Ehud Barak was in, Netanyahu had already done this bombing, and the idea was that and Hezbollah were just killing Israeli soldiers to continue to push them out, to continue to Ehud Barak and to take to withdraw, to continue to make the Israeli moms keep saying this is our Vietnam, we want out. So stakes were high, people were getting killed, and I went to hear Nasrallah speak on the anniversary of his predecessor's death, and the anniversary of the inception of Hezbollah, by this shrine of a car, and he did appear, and then he disappeared, and it was like ready to go. Oh my God, he's here! And so it was almost like an apparition. He spoke, he left, and then we had this long drive back through the Ka, back to the foothills of the mountains, and then over the mountains into the sea. And it started to snow because it was winter, and
Right.
and Hussein goes to see why there's so much traffic at the foothills. Like all of a sudden there's just this huge congestion, and he goes out and he looks, and he walks down like you do in a big traffic jam, and he comes back, he sits in front of the driver's seat, he looks straight ahead, he goes, Courtney, do not look, but Nasrallah is driving the car next to us. And I'm like,
No way.
oh my God.
Wow.
Like, oh my God. And then I'm like, oh my God, get him away from me. Like,
Yeah.
it takes
Yeah,
like
exactly. That's the
15
last place you want to
seconds
be.
take him out, and I'd be collateral damage. I was like, oh my God, Hussein. And like, this is what you do when you're nervous and scared. If you want to know, you look into the mirror and you're like, okay, Hussein, I'm not looking at you. Oh my God, get him out of here. What do you see? Okay, I'm not looking. All right. Okay. And then all of a sudden there's like all this honking, and I can turn. And I turn, and there's a bunch of guys jumping out of the car, other cars with Kalashnikovs, and you can tell by the curve, and their bodyguards, and they just start moving cars. And there's one last road that's like the last road to take the left before you go up into the mountains. And they somehow clear that last road, and the car speeds away with Nasrallah, and they speed off. And I'm like, then Hussein and I can start laughing until we realize we're going to be driving through snow on the way home.
Right.
And so like, yeah, that's like, oh my God, please get him away from me. Oh my God, I was in the backseat of Hariri's car. Oh my God, I'm riding Arafats, horses. Oh my God, I'm walking away from a bombing in the Palestine hotel. I'm walking away from this and walking away from that. I've had a very, very very charmed career.
You sound like an adrenaline junkie that you loved being in the heart of it,
No, there's no adrenaline. Like, no, it's just like, come on, are you living your best life when you're doing that? Hell yeah. Like, what did I just describe to you? Like, that's insane.
Yes.
And then 9/11
Yes,
happens, and there's one Lebanese bomber, right? And the Middle East know enough what they're going to tell you, and then what they're going to tell you in private. Right. So I got to do the legwork for ABC News for the television network, because they need everyone on. And, and I go and I find this doctor that's been interviewed by Der Spiegel, a dentist in the Bekaa. And he's got books on Netanyahu and Israel and Civil War and blah, 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 like all the canon of, the Middle East. And I don't have a camera there. And he's never going to say it on camera. But I say to him, like, okay, so you told me he got radicalized in Germany. He showed me this picture of him in short sleeves at a wedding, but come on. Like, a lot of people say that they didn't mind America's nose being bloodied. They hoped America would maybe finally learn a lesson to stop engaging in funding places, American-made bombs going to, places that are bombing them. And this guy was like, in every single point of I've traced nursery school to elementary to high school. It was like, oh, this is where the Sabra Shatila bombing was. This was where this bombing was. This was this epic, horrible thing that happened. So his life and his schooling had been to like all these inflection points in the Beirut Civil War. And then he goes to Germany, and he's one of the hijackers. And so I say to the guy, fine, you don't want flack that you guys radicalized him or anyone radicalized him. Clearly, that's not what happened here. But can you just tell me, between us, aren't you guys a little happy with what you did? And he goes,
Man.
"Oh, yes. The whole of
Oh,
Bekaa
man.
thinks
Chilling.
he's a great Czechie, which is martyr."
Oh,
And I
my
was like,
God.
thank you. Because there's what you feel, there's the anger, there's the grudges, there's the things you've endured. Nothing comes from a vacuum. None of this comes from a vacuum. And, and yes, if we can look at the most horrific of things this year that have happened so far, yeah, it's Salahuddin wants his hot oil to pour over the Jerusalem walls again. It's not stuff that comes out of nowhere. It's horrific, but it always and so to have that trust, that's where you get the juice. It's not adrenaline. Right. My mom, people were talking to my mother like she had sent like a grade school 11-year-old girl into the Middle East. How do you let her go? What is she doing? And finally, my mom said, "Look, she's not a stuntman. She's a journalist. Like, enough with the adrenaline. I'm a journalist. This stuff was captivating,
right?
And not welcoming. Like, okay, I can see why he became a hijacker in 9/11. That's pretty horrible. Those buildings are my backyard. It is personal. It's not an abstract city. It's my city. It's where I grew up. I went to Windows on the Wall.
Sure.
I had brownies in third grade there. I had, dinner with family friends. My dad worked in that building. My uncle was on vacation that day. It wasn't abstract.
All right. So I'll still tell my story here and the idea of living your best life. So, Courtney, the person that came in after you left Fox was a woman named Emily Wither. Emily Wither, also an excellent journalist in her own right. She was assigned to the same beat that Emily had when she was in Jerusalem and Israel, and she spent a lot of time in Gaza as well. So I'll tell this one story: is that this one weekend I was working there, and she was in, I want to say, the West Bank, I think it was, and this was a time of another dust up between militants and the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. And she's in this one area giving me a report. And as she's giving me this report, you hear a rocket overhead. You hear it. And then, a couple seconds later, it blows up. She's looking up at this rocket. She's like, "Oh my God, I think there's a rocket. I think a rocket just went over." And then she hears it blow up. And she's like, "Holy shit, that just blew up." And then right after that, I was like, no, I'm actually yelling down the line to her, "Emily, are you okay?" She's like, "Yes, I'm fine. I really love my job." That is the kind of journalist and I understand why Larry Shea says, are you adrenaline junkie? No, it's not that. It's right that notion of telling the story as it happens in such a raw form, and it is kind of. Court, I have to ask. And I'm not going to say you're an adrenaline junkie. I think it's so wrong to say that, but is there a part of you that enjoys that being on that edge of danger just a little bit?
The competition, the being first,
right.
The calling it right, being there, experiencing history. Tahrir Square, I called it. I had to call it to our boss at Fox Radio, and I said, "I need to be there." And I show up, and all these other news organizations were showing up. I was pretty independent. I had a great relationship with my managers, and it was like when I interviewed for the job, they were like, "You'll have the Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and all of Africa." And I was like, "Sign me up." And he had trained me at ABC News Radio in 2003. He taught me how to go live. And then all of a sudden I'm working for them. So there was a built-in trust and a relationship that had preceded the job. And also at this point, I'm like, it's going down. But you get the night before, the story happens, you get there and you're all looking at each other. And we were all in the local bar at the Nile Hilton having a beer, waiting to see what was going to happen the next day. And all of our phones went out and we didn't really clock it. Like everyone's self-service stopped. Like, all right, well, I'll see you tomorrow. Weird. Our comms went out. And the next day, it started happening. Like they, the Egyptian police and military split up, there were different wings and sort of almost different bosses even to Mubarak. It all went by that night. I was standing middle of an open area, staring into tear gas, which is like staring into like a movie-made cloud machine. You cannot see through it. But you could hear. And I was hearing the grinding of gears of the tank. And I knew there was nowhere to flatten myself up to. And I didn't know where it was coming. And it burst through the tear gas with people on top of it going like this with flags. It was the first tank into Top-Gear Square that had breached in. And so first you're crying with relief because you're not getting run over. That's adrenaline. The relief of, holy shit, I just
Right.
die. Like, oh my God, I'll live to see another day. And I'm covering the most epic story of my lifetime. And, and then somebody walks up to me and says, and I just have my notebook because our comms are off. And the only way to tell the story is down my one landline. I somehow have the one landline in the whole hotel that hasn't been canceled yet. And so I go out and I record on my phone. And these are not even, and we're not that good at it yet. And this guy just puts his finger onto my notebook and he goes, "Tonight you will write history." That's why I do it.
That concludes part 1 of our incredible conversation with Courtney Kealy. We'll continue with part 2 next week. On behalf of Tushar Saxena, Larry Shea, and me, Larry Samuels, thank you again for joining this episode of No Wrong Choices. If after listening you've thought of someone who could be a great guest, please let us know by sending us a note via the contact page of our website at nowrongchoices.com. While there, please be sure to check out our blog and explore other great episodes while signing up to become a member of our community. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Threads, and X. TikTok is up and content has begun rolling out. We'll be back with another episode next week. Before then, always remember, there are no wrong choices on the road to success, only opportunities, because we learn from every experience.